Oh, oh my God. Hi, David. Welcome to Adventure with Grace.
Excellent. No, great to be here, Grace. Appreciate you having me.
Okay, so to start the show, I would just want to say that, like, when I was listening to your talk at the Madrona Summit, I felt like it was like definitely one of the most memorable ones. I feel like you're such a great storyteller. To start with the show, I would love for the audience to learn more about you. Obviously you went to school in Seattle. Were you always like a Seattle person? Like, what were like some core lessons that you've learned from, selling popcorns at like a movie theater to now, like, you have been the CEO of Foursquare, and then now you're the CEO and co-founder of Read.ai. Why don't we start with some like core lessons that you've learned early on in your career that you kind of took to become the CEO today?
Yeah, I'd say one of the core lessons that I had was from my parents really early on, where they were immigrants from Korea. They were college educated. They came over and they did jobs that were really outside of their normal. And the way that they really tackled it was, if you couldn't do it well right off the bat, you throw yourself into it and you put hours, you put time, you put effort into it. And at certain points, you'll hit that point where it's like, hey, this is now a skill that I have. So my dad couldn't speak very good English. He was ultimately ended up selling cars. And when he started selling cars, he sold to Koreans to start with because he's Korean background. But then he started to expand into other groups, other cultures, general population. And he became one of the best sellers in the Seattle area. My mom started a deli. She really went in and said, like, hey, we can't hire a number of employees to start off because we don't have enough money. But if I throw myself, if I put the effort in and I start to build that business up, she started to see returns. And so for me, it's, if you don't know how to do it, it's really, you got to throw yourself at it and you can figure out a way to do it. If they can do it, I can do it. And so that was kind of a big thing that was ingrained in my DNA at an early age. From there, I just kind of used it for things like when I was it 16 years old, I started trading stocks, and I was trading so much. And this dates me because I was using a company called eBroker, and there was on a website and you put in manual orders and you click and you'd have to wait like 30 minutes for a transaction to get confirmed. Because I think someone on the other side was just taking a piece of paper and then putting it into a stock trading terminal and buying the stock. But I traded so much, I broke it. And so they came back and said, like, hey, we can't take your business anymore. And I said, oh man, what can I do? And I found this ability to trade stocks in an office. But in order to do that, I had to get my Series 7, 24, and 65 license. So I had to become a stockbroker. So at the age of 17, I became the youngest stockbroker in the nation from a licensing perspective. And then I was able to trade stocks, and I did pretty well with that. But it was really kind of like, okay, they tell you can't do it. Then you say like, okay, how do I then get to do that? So that's been my early days of career.
I have a quick question about that. I feel like there's a lot of things that, like, you can learn. So for example, let's say if you are running a store or like selling something, but like, I feel like a lot of the other for example, like stock trading, or like nowadays, I feel like a lot of the entrepreneurship stuff around AI, it's like harder to figure it out. Like, what's your kind of like roadmap to like figure out how to do XYZ? So for example, let's say right now you're managing an AI product that's in the meeting space. I'm sure like at the beginning you have to study the space, you have to like see. I know that you guys started with like sentiment of like meetings. So when you were at like Foursquare, you were like observing people's like behavior in meetings, and then you design this app. And then also, I believe you also caught up like Eric Yuan from Zoom. You're like, hey, like I just want to validate the idea of like, is this something that worth looking at? I feel like those are some really interesting things. I wonder, how do you, number one, figure out like what is the problem? And then number two is like, how do you kind of like solve the problem? Like, who do you hire as a co-founder? And then like, who do you hire in the first like few weeks to like put together, to ensemble the team to like, go after it?
So the founding of Read was really interesting because I was at Foursquare, it was peak COVID, and we had a bunch of meetings. And Read wasn't in my idea space at all. It wasn't even kind of a problem that I wanted to solve at the moment. It was more like I was sitting on a call and I was like, man, I've got 20 people on this call and no one is paying attention. They're either camera is off and they're on mute. Hey, they're talking to someone over here, but they're on mute. All these things I picked up, and I was like, okay, there's 20 people on this call. I was the CEO of Foursquare, so I generally knew how much each person made. And I was doing the math in my head. I was like, this is not a good use of time. And so it just stuck with me to say, like, this is very inefficient. And when I left Foursquare, I was looking at a lot of different ideas. I was looking at things around connected TV. I was looking at things around advertising, and analytics is kind of what I always came back to. And what was happening was I was having more and more meetings with different people where people were like asking me for advice, or I was asking them, what do you think about X, Y, or Z? And I just started to understand, like, within a minute or two, is this going to be a good conversation or not? And I think you know this too with all the interviews that you've done. It's, you know, right away where it's like, this is going to be good or this isn't going to be good. And then if it's not good, we've all done the thing where it's like, you got your phone here and you start to look at it a little bit, you're looking away, you're trying not to scan. But those things you start to pick up. And so what got me interested in all the meetings I was having post Foursquare was, it is interesting that I could visually tell when someone wasn't paying attention to what I was saying, or when someone else was presenting, if other people weren't paying attention, I was able to go in and see, because you have like the 8x8 screen, people weren't paying attention. And so I said, okay, this is really interesting. Meetings are becoming more and more of a problem, in the sense of everybody was having meeting. In the early days of COVID, everyone would invite everybody else to a meeting because you wanted to make sure people didn't feel excluded because everyone was working from home. But what I found was, like, this is not the right way to do it. People are learning this new activity. They're being too inclusive almost, in terms of like, you're adding everybody. When you're too inclusive in a meeting sense, you're actually stealing time away from that person, because they want to be like, oh, Grace invited me to a meeting. This must be important, so I'm going to join, versus like, Grace invited 42 people to this meeting. It might not be as important. Mm-hmm. So I started to look at that, and I said, okay, this is interesting. And then I said, hey, there's a lot of people already doing transcription. And so I didn't want to be in a transcription company. There's probably 40 companies that were doing it at the time. So I said, what can I do that's different? And what was different was, can I see how people react to the words that were said? So when I say something and you nod your head, great. Or at the IA40, when I say a joke and nobody laughs, I get a reaction. I was like, okay, don't tell any more jokes. You're not very good at this. They're not feeling you. Or, hey, as I dive into a use case or a story, people start nodding their head and they put their phones down. I'm able to read that. So I said, can we take that and actually model that out? And this was before AI. This was like early 2021, where people were talking about AI, but it wasn't as mainstream as it is today. And so we started to build these models. But what I did was I said, hey, are there any off-the-shelf models that exist? The answer was no. There weren't any off-the-shelf models. And I said, are there any adjacent models? And the adjacent models were things like security video, where you can go in and start to identify, is this suspicious activity? There was things along the lines of like when you do customer interviews where you're one-on-one and they're talking about a product. When you're watching a movie, they're doing the screen and doing the eye recognition. So are you nodding your head? Are you looking away? Are you looking at your phone? And so all those things were like separate papers that existed. And I kind of took them all and I started to reach out to folks. And I said, hey, have you ever thought about this in a meeting environment? Have you thought about like measuring engagement, sentiment, not just based on the words? And they're like, no, it's not technically possible to do, but it is interesting. It would be valuable. It's like, okay, check the box, interesting and valuable. The models do exist in some form if I can bring them all together and make it novel and unique for meetings. And then I said, okay, this is interesting. Do I think this is a problem? Yes. And then Eric was great when I joined Foursquare and I became CEO. He reached out to me. He said, like, hey, David, just want to say congratulations. Great to see you in the community. Let me know if I can be a resource. Awesome guy. As I started thinking about analytics and meetings, I pinged him. I said, hey, Eric, quick call. I just want to ask you, 5 minutes. Have you thought about this? Do you think it's a big market? And he came back and we jumped on a call and he said, like, hey, this is a really interesting idea. This was actually something that was requested by our customers. But when COVID hit, this was kind of secondary to the 100x increase that we saw in terms of activity. This is an interesting problem. This is something you probably should be working on. And so I took that as kind of the green light to go in and say, hey, CEO of Zoom is telling me this is a good idea. This is worth exploring. All right, I think that's good. I think it's a good idea. And so that's where we kind of started that journey around kind of measuring meetings and measuring reactions in meetings.
I wonder, I really like that. Like you kind of like validate the idea before you like jump in, and you have like a lot of insights on like the meetings, how to run effective meetings from like the client perspective as a CEO. I wonder, so like to put, I guess like to put everything together, like to ensemble the team, to fundraise, since you're like a multiple time entrepreneur, and then you're like, honestly, I look at your profile. I was like so shocked that you're like LP of like literally all the top funds, as well as like tons of like AI companies. What were some like things that kind of like ran through your head on like, how to build like an investor board table, as well as like, recruiting the first, like, I guess like the co-founder and like just other people in general?
Yeah, I think from a recruiting and co-founder perspective, it's going in and just seeing early on, it's easier, I would say, than it is later on. And by that, what I mean is you've got your personal network, you're working on an idea, you start talking to people about the idea. And if you've had past success, and I think I'm lucky that I've had a couple of successes in my career, but with the past success, people are kind of, it's a gravitational pull to say, okay, what is David working on next? And so that's given me the opportunity to say like, hey, let me tell you about what I'm thinking about. And as they start to think about what's my next opportunity, I can go in and say, hey, I've worked with you before, or I've worked adjacent to you. I think we'd be a great team. Would you be interested in coming on board? And so it just organically happens. And I think that's the important part.
Oh, I have another question for you. So like, I'm sure like you would also get rejections, even you're like very successful now, but like, I feel like every successful person come through, like, come from like a lot of like everybody got like, failures or like challenges. I wonder what's your like mental roadmap on like, for example, let's say, you try to recruit someone and then you invested so much into the talent and then they leave, or like same as like, investor or customer, like, you pitch hard and then you gave them all the data and then they leave, all that kind of stuff. How do you kind of like navigate all these, like every day there's like fire going on? Like, how do you kind of like power through that from like a founder perspective?
I think you just brush it off. I think that's the biggest thing. Like your job is to get rejected. I think I've been rejected by hundreds of VCs. I've been rejected by thousands of customers. I've been rejected by thousands of potential new employees. And the thing is, it's not always going to be a fit. You're going in cold in a lot of times where it's like, hey, Grace, can you make an intro into X? You make that introduction. I've never met them before. That's like going in and saying, if I have the expectation that they're going to marry me when I go on a first date, that's going to result in a really bad experience versus if someone comes in and says, hey, nice to meet you. This is what we're working on. They ask some questions. And I go in there and say like, were they really interested or not? Because what you do a lot of the times, both personally as well as from a business perspective, is you have this fallacy of like, because I met with you an hour, you owe me this. And they don't owe you anything. Like it was a cold meeting. They took the time to meet with you. If it didn't work out, the thing that you should actually take from that is, hey, what didn't work out? Where was it that I screwed up on the pitch? Where did I linger too long on something? Hey, you know what? Looking back at it, I spent 30 minutes talking about myself, and that's not a good thing. And that's where I think Read really came out with the analytics and we saw this where you could see, oh, I was doing a VC call and I only spoke 20% of the time, but as an intro call, that's something where I need to reflect and say, hey, I let them dominate the conversation when they're here to meet me, and I need to give them a story that they understand, that they want to move forward with. And so if you can look at your failures as opportunities to learn, even the smallest thing to say, I shouldn't have said that, let me try this differently, it actually lets you adjust. And that was really important on the fundraising side as well, where you have meetings, you will get rejected more times than not. But as those meetings continue, you have to understand, like, what are they reacting to? Are they nodding their head on, it's AI, this is really cool, this is enterprise. Hey, you're getting over 100,000 new signups today, that's great. But then when I start talking about the cost model and it's monthly versus subscription, those things, they start to go, they're not. I need to be able to adjust for that and either tell a narrative that addresses that directly, or figure out like what's wrong with my model that people are not agreeing with this. How do I make this adjustment? So it's awesome feedback as long as people do not take it personally. Rejection is a great resource.
Another thing is like, I feel like the more I go on about life, I don't mean to talk about life right now, but like the more I go on about like business or like life, I feel like a lot of it's like the psychology of like basically like the psychology management kind of thing. So I wonder, how do you manage like, oh, okay, so this person gave you like a really harsh feedback. Do you take it or not take it? And then if two people gave you like two opposite feedback, I'm sure like there are investors who are telling you go to direction A. There's like another like investor would tell you to go to like direction B, which is like the complete opposite. How do you kind of like navigate through these like 4,000 opinions coming from the outside world? Like, how do you pick like which one is like the right strategy as a CEO of your own AI company?
Yeah, you have to have some core beliefs that you won't move unless there's overwhelming evidence that you're wrong. So a core belief for us was, we think transcription alone is not as valuable as if you can put transcription with reaction. So David said,
right,
Grace responded this way. So that was a core belief. If I met with someone and they said like, that doesn't matter. Transcript's fine. Just drop into OpenAI, drop it into Claude. Like it's going to be fine. We're probably not going to be a fit because our belief is like, this is really important. We spent patents, time, et cetera, against that. Where it's more about the business model, it's kind of a decision to go in and say, hey, here's a great example. When we were thinking about raising our Series A, Goodwater led it. They were completely bought in. They actually proactively reached out to us. But we were kind of thinking about it. We're having just informal conversations. And people were like, oh, what's your SaaS model? How many people are you going to bring on board for the sales team? Are you going to hire one AE, one SDR, and for each $1 million, you hire this pair of two, and this is how you should scale it out, and show me that the repeatable pattern is there, and then we're good. And I was like, no, that's not the vision that we're going after. We want to be a mainstream AI solution where in a lot of cases, it's the first time they've ever used AI, and we're able to give ROI on day one. And a lot of folks were like, I don't believe in that. That's not the right approach. You got to sell this as a SaaS product. And we are a SaaS product, but they wanted us to build a sales team that knocks on doors. And I was like, no, this is the value and the ROI is fundamentally there right after the meeting that you get the notes. So I'm going to disagree with you. And had I gone the other route, we would be one of like 50 companies that are in the transcription and summary space. Where we ultimately ended up is the fastest growing meeting note taker ever. We went from number 20 in terms of market share to number 2. We are adding, was it October? We did 600,000 plus new signups on a monthly basis, which is faster than almost any company out there. Ramp has us as the 6th fastest growing AI vendor. So it's kind of going in and saying like, you got to have your core beliefs. Now, they can have good feedback on like, hey, your onboarding process is horrible. You need to change this. I've seen this work. Oh, absolutely. Thank you for looking at that. I didn't even think about that. That's great feedback. But you got to stay strong with your core beliefs in a lot of cases.
I love that. Like, I wonder, you just mentioned about like you guys are one of the fastest growing AI companies out there. And I wonder, from a product perspective, you mentioned about like, Goodwater, they're great firm based on data. And like, I wonder, how do you think about the product and go to market? Like, so now I know that like, you want to build a AI model that can like kind of react on people's, or like taking notes on like people's reaction, and like based off the reaction, you give them some sort of solution to the meeting improvement as well as like meeting notes and like all the meeting feedback. I wonder how they think about what would be the core use case of the product. Even you mentioned like, oh, okay, so we want to go to the mass market, but like, who would be the first, like, let's call it like 10 people that should be using this? Is that like the moms, or like such as like people work at Microsoft, obviously? Like, and I wonder, how do you think about, the go to market right after you create the product?
Yeah, from a go to market, it's a good question. From a go to market perspective, you could have thesis on this is what's going to work. What we've been really kind of lucky with is we built a product that was more horizontal. And we said, hey, we're actually not going to build for a specific use case. We got a lot of pushback from VCs where we said, hey, we're not going to build a sales use case. We're not going to build an education use case. We're going to build a horizontal product that works for 80, 90% of the use cases. And it covers the need that a teacher would have versus a project manager at a FANG company versus an oil driller in Nigeria versus someone who works for state government that's doing elder care. Like those groups are all like, you'd be like, oh, those don't seem like one segment you should go after. But those are the segments that we're seeing massive traction against, where elder care, as an example, they're going out in the field and they take their phones out and they go in and talk with people and they interview and they just make sure everyone's in a good condition. But they deal with like 50 to 100 clients on a monthly basis. So you can't remember everybody. You can't remember like, was he a little bit slow to respond this time versus the last time? But now with AI, you can actually go in and say, hey, it's not just about the Zoom meeting, but it's about going in and saying, in person, I have this audio file, I got permission to record. And I'm noticing over the last 3 months now, they're asking fewer questions. They're responding with shorter answers. This is kind of concerning. I should spend more time and dive into this next time around. So it's able to go in and say, hey, you have a use case that is not traditional, but we're able to give you the technology to say, I can compare the report from 1 month ago to today and see what the delta is and what the difference is. And I think that's the market that we're going after and the adoption that we've seen. Now, let's be clear. If that horizontal play didn't work out, I would have gone found out what's the narrow play, who's the client that's going after. But we've been really kind of mission driven on what is the broader use case. And that's where it goes to like, we're not trying to build a single source that you only come to read. Like we send reports by email, we send them by Slack, the Notion integration that we introduced, the Jira, the Confluence, the HubSpot, the Salesforce, everything of us about pushing our data out, because we're not trying to go in and say, oh, let me give you another website or another app you need to log into to see the reports. We want to work wherever you work. And so we did that. And then recently we released a solution called Read.ai for Gmail, where we said, hey, let us pull down your emails. Let us give you summaries on your emails. But then let me bump that summary against actual meetings, and let me bump that against messages. So good example is you and me, Grace. We met at the IA 40. There might have been a recording that I uploaded there. And it's like, great, I've got a meeting of the IA 40. And then you and I emailed back and forth to say, hey, let's schedule. It'd be great to talk on the podcast. Do that. That's awesome. Then we go in and we meet right now, and we have this video. And then we might have another meeting that says like, hey, I had a couple of follow-up questions. What do you think about this? All of those things could be on Outlook, on StreamYard, on HubSpot, in person, and they're all disparate. So even if you have an AI solution that is awesome for that one platform, you're missing out on 3/4 of the information if you aren't able to go across the board. And that's really our bigger vision. Is it's not just about meetings. It's meetings is the key starting point, but it's going and saying, where else do you work? You do emails. We're pulling that in. We work with Outlook and Gmail, Slack for messaging, as well as Teams for messaging, and then CRMs that we're adding in, as well as other workforce or workflow solutions.
I wonder, so like, there's a lot of actually the other day when people are telling me about like, they're building a AI agent for the enterprise. So basically like an enterprise assistant,
Yep.
co-pilot, whatever you call it. And like, but I feel like Read AI could potentially be that solution, since you guys have like so many integrations. However, I feel like I have like two questions around that.
Yeah.
One is like the future of meetings, because right now, obviously, people are leveraging Zoom as well as like, these like online meeting app. But I do feel like after the pandemic, the in-person meeting was happening a lot. How do you kind of like capture the in-person meeting market space? And also, like, honestly, sometimes when I see like my meeting notes that have like a lower sentiment, what does that mean? Like, how do I up the sentiment? Even I feel like a lot of people, they're just maybe introverts or something. They don't talk that much. How do I like convince myself that like, I mean, what do I need to do in terms of like, when I got like the meeting notes are like my sentiment is poor, or like, also for the coaching space, like what does the talking pace or like filler words kind of things that mean? Like, what do I need to do to like kind of improve?
Oh, 100%. I think those are two great questions. So on the in-person meetings, really the focus is the mobile application. We released the iOS app. And what the app is really focusing around is taking your calendar and understanding when there isn't a Zoom meeting, but you've got an invite into somebody. It's recognizing, oh, this is likely an in-person if there is no link. All right, we're going to send you a notification that says, hey, do you want to start Read Up? Do you want us to measure this call? If you say yes, great. And we're able to actually record with your permission, and if you notify the other person, and then we give you a meeting report after it's done. So it keeps that series in place, and it tries to be as seamless as possible, because it's not realistic that you're going to open up your laptop, you're going to then turn on Zoom or Google Meet or Microsoft Teams, hit record, and then have that conversation. You want that automation in place. So really, that's where we're focusing around. The in-person side. So also with the in-person stuff, it's great to meet in person. It's an additional layer, but we're also seeing them for the digital or the virtual. People are sending Read in their place. Like at first people were like, what's going on? Like Read, no one was on the call that actually sent Read. What's going on? Is this broken? Why are you on the call? It's like, oh, we're actually starting to see people are skipping the call and just sending Read, and they're looking at the notes. Because what happens is, one, you might be like, hey, there's probably 5 minutes that I really care about this meeting, so I don't need to sit in an hour-long call. So I'm going to send Read. They're going to give me the notes, and I can jump to the place that I want to. The second thing is, within our reports, we've got a thing called readouts or for you, where we'll aggregate multiple meetings, even the ones that you aren't in. So we'll start to give you summaries, and we'll start to answer questions that maybe you were in a meeting, you didn't have an answer to the question, but you sent Read to another meeting and it had the right answer, and we saw the client was nodding their head up and down. This is a good one. We're actually going to auto-populate that. So it actually learns for you, and it helps you answer your questions. So I think that's really a key component around Read and delivering it wherever you are or wherever you don't want to be at the time. So I think that's important. On the coaching side, we made a really clear distinction. We do not want to be the person that you go to and say, I want to police my team. I want to track what they're doing. We actually don't have any of those solutions in place where you can see that. We actually, for the coaching, only give it to you. So if you swear a lot, you might be like, I don't swear that much. We'll only put it in your report. We don't put it to your manager. We don't put it in the overall organization. You can't even actually see it. So what that does is it makes people feel more comfortable. So we've had things like, I'll give you an example. A VC that we are really good friends with said, hey, I used Read for the first time. And this was really bad because it was an intro call. And I used this example earlier. I spoke 90% of the time on an intro call. And I'm the VC. I need to change the way that I do things because in reality, I should be listening 90% of the time to understand, is this a company that I want to learn more about? And so they actually changed their behavior on their own. And with coaching, we have the belief that people always want to improve. Like if you have the ability to improve, it's how easy is it? How hard is it? That's kind of the question comes up. But if it's in front of you, you're like, okay, this is not my boss telling me, this is not my coworker, this is not my parent. This is the AI going in and saying like, David, you talk way too fast. And here, we're going to find the clips of where you started talking at 275 words per minute and I hit play. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. I am talking too fast. And so that type of feedback loop is something where AI can only do. Because if a manager said, hey, I recorded you and look, here's a video of you talking way too fast, that's when you can get defensive. Like, no, it's because of X, Y, and Z. But now you're able to coach yourself. The second thing is on the sentiment side. Low sentiment is actually pretty common depending on the type of call that you're having. So with engineers, the sentiment will actually go below 70 in a lot of cases because you're talking about, hey, this is broken. What are we doing to solve this problem? How do we fix this? And so you actually do expect to see negative sentiment. That's a good thing because you don't want people to be happy when the servers go down. You're like, all right, what are we going to do to fix this? What's the action item? What are next steps? But the sentiment tells you what are the things that are the right solutions in certain ways where it's like, hey, people are really negative. And all of a sudden it goes up for a second because someone said something that's really interesting, that's valuable. Like, oh, that's a good point. And they start nodding their head. The AI can then go in and say, hey, in the question and answer section, let's bubble that up because that seems something that's more important to everybody. So really, as long as you take it with the framework of it's not criticizing you, but it's trying to help you, it's trying to give you more information so that you can communicate better or get better information to make a decision, people start to dive into it all the time. And so we've got one of our early and still large segment is coaches. Like coaches love to use it because they're able to break down what they do, but they can also give it to their clients to say like, hey, here's some feedback on how you speak. It's a little bit too fast. And here's a section. And look, even the AI says your engagement goes down here and your sentiment goes down here. And what's really cool though is I have a really low on the modeling side. You can't go in and say one size fits all for models. Males, females, ethnicity, tone, all those things can change the way the models work. So you have to actually have a dynamic model. So we have a real-time model, but after a conversation is done, what we'll do is we'll create custom baselines for each person on the call. And we'll go in and say, and this is me, I have a low resting face compared to the average. Like I look mean, I look angry, I look annoyed when I'm not talking and I'm paying attention. But then what I do is we go and say, hey, that's David's baseline. So now apply the model against that baseline to see when does it go up and down from David's baseline. So that level of customization is really key to understand like differences in personality and behavior and culture.
I love that. And I wonder, so I'm just looking at my Read app. I wonder, oh, by the way, hi, Yash. So I want to say hi to the audience, but I wonder when it comes to like, turn that into action items. So I know that you guys did a lot of collaborations with like, the Google team, Microsoft team, and all that kind of stuff. How do you like think about which one would be the most impactful collaboration, and like how do you kind of like start with like partnering with like the bigger companies, since like I feel like any startup will like most startup want to partner with like bigger companies, but like people probably don't know how to actually start the conversation. Do you have any tips for people who are like maybe creating AI in a different space to think about the collaboration side? Also, the big tech companies are also doing a lot of innovations in the AI space. So maybe they will just do something themselves. Like, how do you think about, where to go in or where not to go in?
Yeah. So from a partnership perspective, especially for early stage startups, you shouldn't bet the farm on partnerships, because what's going to happen is you're like, oh, they should love us. They should highlight us everywhere. This is going to be incredible. That could be the case, but in reality, there's probably 100 apps in the ecosystem. You have no traction. They're going to focus in on the apps that actually have the traction and the adoption in place. So I think that's an important thing to consider. Then this next step goes in and says, okay, if that is the case, what ecosystems can I plug into where I submit an app, where I go in and I don't need to talk to anyone. I don't need a special relationship. I just know I can go through that process. So Zoom has an app store. Microsoft has an app store. Google has an app store. So it's going in and figuring out, hey, what's the normal process for anybody? But then getting the introductions to go and say, hey, I just want to get on your radar. I understand what you're doing. I want to make sure that you understand what Read is doing or whatever your startup is. And then as you start to hit different milestones, so it's like, hey, we hit 1,000 installs, we hit 10,000 installs. Hey, our engagement level is 81% after 30 days. Then they're like, oh, this is kind of interesting. That gives them ammunition to say, hey, from all the other hundreds of apps, now I'm going to figure out, is there a better slot to put you in? And that's really been helpful for us, where we've gone in and said, we can talk to the most important people that can move the needle, but I need to show them that people care about it, that their audience cares about it. But the minute you get traction, that's when you go in hard and you say like, hey, this is what's going, this is what's working. And so I would recommend anyone who's think about partnerships, absolutely do them, but don't bet the farm and say like, oh, just because I got intro to the VP of product or the VP of marketplace, that it's going to be the number one app. That's not how it works. Like, it really requires you to drive that activity, to drive that adoption.
How do you think about, since like you're the chief meeting officer here, so how do you think about how many meetings it takes to close like a partner?
Well, that's a hard one. It really varies on case by case, but I would go in and say, from closing a partner from an adoption standpoint, like let's use, we're Google Meet workspace partner. They just highlighted it across a large number of workspace owners, where they said like, we're one of the integrations that they would recommend you try out. And we're one of, I think it was like 13 apps that they highlighted. So we're like huge. Like, this is pretty much anyone who has a workspace kind of knows about us now. They see us in the Google App Store, where we're one of, like Google Meet, we're one of 7 apps that are available there. And with that, it took a little bit. It was kind of like, we had to show traction. We had to go in and say like, we've got success in metrics. Then we got the ability to go in and say like, hey, here's an SDK. We started to move really quickly. And I think this is something that startups, and especially early stage startups, should do. When they give you a window of opportunity to say like, here, you got a chance to come in here, but it depends on how fast you move. You go in and you're the fastest person. You're the one that goes in and says 3 days later, hey, I already built it out. Here you go. It's ready to go. All of a sudden now they're like, okay, they've got their tentpole to say, I've started their snowball on their side to say, I'm releasing an app store, I'm releasing this promotion, whatever that is. But you're the first. You're the one that's easy to work with. I think if you can take more of those pressure points off of them and put it on you, the more likely it is going to be a faster partnership, a faster agreement that comes into place. So I think that's something to keep in mind. Like, you're never going to beat like, hey, if you're Figma or if you're Atlassian versus an early stage startup, they've got millions of users. Are you going to beat them on scale? No, but you could definitely beat them on speed.
I completely agree. I feel like speed is everything. Speaking of speed, I feel like, as cringe as it may sound, the AI space moved really fast. How do you think about like which technology to incorporate into Read and which part you like maybe hold off on? Like, how do you think about the unfair advantage Read has versus like the 4,000 meeting apps? Obviously, you mentioned about like the sentiment or like, reading the room, like basically giving you some solutions on like how the meeting went from like a real life perspective, like a coaching perspective. Like, but how do you think about that core one thing from like human psychology that like differentiate your thing versus like the 400 other meeting app?
Yeah, I think our differentiator is that we're everywhere. And by that, I think it's going and saying meetings is a part of it, but it's only a quarter, it's only a fifth, it's only a tenth of the actual conversation that occurs. So like I said, with the emails, like you have a great call with the client and they're like, this is awesome, let's follow up on email. Well, if I have the best AI model, it still doesn't know what happened. It doesn't know like, was there a follow-up? Did they actually sign a contract? What was the outcome? But if you're able to connect email into that, now you can say, hey, did this meeting go well? They said these things, but actually they never followed up and you emailed them 6 times. Okay, what was now a really good meeting was not a good meeting. So let's look at it a little bit differently. What were the points where they had negative engagement, where their sentiment actually did drop down, and you're able to analyze that? And what the AI is doing and where we're really focused in around is one, it's generating the summary, it's pushing it out wherever you want, but it's pulling the data down and saying, connect the dots between the email, the messaging, the Jira ticket, the Salesforce opportunity, and create a more cohesive summary. But then optimization. It's starting to go in and say, hey, next time this happens, when they ask about the methodology, don't say this, because when you say this is the thing that results in a better outcome, because for whatever reason, your other explanation doesn't resonate with the customer. So you might not have ever picked that up. It might have taken you another 100 meetings, but Read is able to go in and say, hey, this is the right path to go. This is how you should optimize this opportunity. Because the way that you need to really think about it is, it's all about, I don't want to get into advertising, but it really is like ad tech in a way where it's like, you've got inventory on Facebook, on Snapchat, on Google, you've got Roku with connected TV, and you've got all these disparate sources. And if you only have one, you could say like, hey, I think this drove the conversion, but it might have been the Facebook ad, it might have been the Google ad, it might have been the Snapchat ad. And so you need that holistic picture. But once you have the holistic picture, you can optimize. And I think there have been a couple stories lately on why digital advertising is doing so well right now. It's because if you can measure that return on investment, people will just turn on as much money as they can to continue to get the sales, to continue to get the purchases. And I think take that now concept and apply it to your time. And you're able to connect more things that you're spending time on, and it's able to find you those efficiencies all day long. And where we're excited about is even more is like, we've got this holistic optimization side of things, but it's then going in and saying multiplayer, where you meet with so many people. You've got this extensive database of some of the best investors, entrepreneurs, executives in the world. Well, now if you start sharing those pieces where someone has say, hey, Grace, do you have advice on this? You might say, hey, here's one email. I just shared this to you on Read. Now it's in your database where if you get a question that comes up, it's going to take Grace's conversation with Eric, or it's going to take Grace's conversation with Sally, and it's going to go in and say, this is what happened, and this is really important, and this was successful for them. All of a sudden, you don't even need to explain it, but they have that persistent context now. And that's where multiplayer mode, which we'll launch later this year, is going to go in and say like, hey, I can learn from others, but I don't have to sit through an hour-long meeting to learn. I can just drop that into my AI database.
How do you think about which AI model? Like you mentioned that you guys use multiple model, and I wonder, how do you think about which piece of technology that will be impactful? And how do you, I know that like, you guys have like a great engineering team, and like, I wonder, how do you think about how, like, which part to incorporate, which part not to, like from the product perspective, to leverage like the newest AI? And I feel like AI also changes really fast. Like, how do you think about, oh, okay, we just launched this, but like there's a newer model come out and like that actually does this on a different app or something? How do you think about that?
Yes, the way that we think about it is 90% of our processing and our own in-house models. So they're proprietary to our use case. So be it meetings, be it emails. Like example is like we've got a model that goes in and says, hey, this person is important to you in meetings. You have also emails that go back and forth. How quickly do you reply to them in the email? If your normal response time is 2 hours, but whenever this person replies back, it's 10 minutes. Okay, this is even more important. So when there are topics associated with that, bubble that up. Like that is a model that does not exist with any large language model, et cetera. But it's a lot of processing, it's a lot of customization, but it's something that we found our customers find high value in. So we'll build that ourselves, where we will use kind of the models that are out there that are production quality, OpenAI, Claude, et cetera, is where it's like, hey, we got everything done. We found the 16 topics that we think are super interesting that the large language models went and picked up, because it's when David's nodding his head like this and it responds really fast to an email. That's not metadata that's in a large language model. And so, but it says like, hey, here's 16 topics. Here are the sentences that we think are most interesting. Hey, OpenAI, can you summarize this in a way that it's easier to read for somebody? And so that's kind of that last mile where we don't need to spend all those resources. They've built a best in class that they're continuing to invest in that. But it's up to us to go and say, what's that kind of ingredient that we're putting in there? And then it's there. It's just make it into a really clean, readable format. Like make it easily kind of searchable in terms of the content structure that we want to put in. That's something where they're incredibly good at, that we want to continue to use. And you'll start to see that, I think, in the future with like multimodal, where you're starting to see like, hey, how do I translate voice into text? And they're not doing all the things yet. They're just doing voice to text. That's what multimodal is in a lot of cases. But then it's going to get into narration at some point. It might be 2-3 years from now. But at that point, we're going to be working on the next thing to bring in the data. So it's always about let the hard stuff that is kind of commoditized, let them keep working on it. Make that better. They've got massive scale, but where you're unique, like continue to invest aggressively in that. And that's where kind of our thesis has been around.
Totally. I want to switch gear a little bit. So since like you have been an LP of like a many top funds and you're a successful founder, um, I want to ask two part of the questions. Like one is like, what do you think, which type of fund that you feel like recently started that kind of like will outrun a lot of like the multi-generation firm, and then why? And then the other part is like as a second time found, I don't think you're second time, I think you're multi-time founders. So like you're previously you have a really successful exit. How do you think about like, let's say if a younger investor want to attract you slash putting money into your company, what gives them an edge versus let's call it like, you're LP of Madrona, you're LP of ACNZ, like all these like bigger players.
Yeah. So with the first question, I would go in and say, this is something that founders do not do enough that they should do. So if you have the ability, even a small amount of investable money, and you have a VC that is very, very good, that's a great track record, you shouldn't just be taking money from them. You should ask them, hey, do you have an entrepreneur fund? Do you have a, investor, a co-founder fund? A lot of times they'll go and say, yeah, we do. And the minimums are actually a lot lower where you can start to participate and invest it. So that's actually unlocked a lot of the funds that I'm a LP in today. Has been like, hey, this fund is usually closed, no one's allowed in. But when I was CEO of Foursquare, they have a lot of top tier investors. When I was CEO of Place, a lot of top tier investors. Snap got to know a lot of top tier investors. And even now at Read, I've got to know a lot of top tier investors where it's like, these are funds that I wouldn't have normally been welcome to just because couldn't be able to cut a big enough check. I wouldn't know that they're opening up or they're raising. But now I've got a window where it's like, hey, we've got a relationship. If they're smart enough to invest in me, I should be smart enough to invest in them. Mm-hmm. And the returns there have been great. And like I would absolutely recommend any founder who's working with a top tier VC or a VC that they really believe in that might not be a high up name that they know, but it's an up and comer. Always ask, like, is there an opportunity to invest in the fund? So I'd say that's really one thing that you really need to focus in on that you should do. I think two, with if you're starting to raise money and you're starting to figure out how do you get the attention of these funds and the interest level, it is hard. Like I would say, like it is ridiculously hard to break through the mold. And I think you have to go in with two things. So one is you have to work your network a little bit to say, can I get an intro? And you have to go in and say like, hey, I'm not going to bet the farm on this, but I need to put on a good show. And a lot of times, how do I differentiate myself from the other 50 companies that have a wrapper for a different AI solution? Because that's their immediate reaction is going to be. If I don't know who you are, I think it's an interesting idea. I'm going to kind of criticize it a little bit and figure out like, can I break this down to, is there any meat on the bones, or is this just kind of a fancy picture that I look at, but there's nothing behind the wall? And so that's what they're going to go dive and do. So just make sure that you've got some meat on the bones where you can show what you're doing that is different. If you got some track record, I think it is actually pretty straightforward to do for a seed round. I've got friends right now that have worked at companies like Snap, Foursquare, where they're able to raise money. Not a ridiculous, you're not going to raise the $10 million, $5 million seed round, but hey, you raise a $500,000 seed round and you're able to get 2 or 3 people that are co-founders working on it. That's a great opportunity. That's a huge win. So I would say, if you're a first-time founder and you don't necessarily have as strong of a track record, don't shoot for the moon right off the bat. Like either spend your time building a product that has some level of kind of traction or meat or some type of provability, or go in with the attitude of like, hey, I'm going to learn, I'm going to get the introductions. And if I find that right product market fit on the investor side, that's going to be the conversation that extends.
I wonder, so like, what about, since like a lot of our listeners are also like emerging managers, so like they are starting their own VC funds, and like you have worked with some of like the top tier funds, and how do you think about like for the younger people who are like the younger investors, like trying to like kind of like break through the noise to build like a firm? And like if let's say they want to invest in like David's next venture, like how do you pick, like, you have like, you can have options for like the bigger funds, but like how do you think about like, having the emerging managers onto the cap table? Like how do you think about, they could add value to you, or like, how do they build an edge basically?
Yeah, I would say for the emerging venture funds, the emerging angels, where you've got a small fund that you're doing, I think a couple things are critical. So one is always be present. And by that, I mean is when you're raising a round and you're raising a 5, 10, $15 million round, you're not thinking about the 25, 50, $100,000 check. You're like, I need to get this big thing done. I'm going to have some follow-up, and then it's pretty much done. I've got the round closed. I'm ready to move on. So you have to be there all the time. Like, and it's not something where I feel bad sometimes where when we've raised, and as well at Read, at Place, where we've raised money, sometimes there's a great person that I really wanted on the cap table, but I forgot because I was doing so many things and we've already got all these other investors lined up. Had they reached out at the right time, as if they were top of mind, I would have actually gone and said, oh yeah, we'll make room for you, no problem at all. But it has to be that timing issue. You have to be in their, not in their face is not the right way, but you have to be in their area to just say, like, hey, just checking in, what's going on? Any raise coming up, let me know. I would be really interested in learning more. That's the one key from an emerging. The second, and I think this is the thing that a lot of people miss out on, is use the product. Because if you can use the product as much as you can. I remember VCs that would reach out to me and they would say like, oh, we love your product, et cetera. And I'd go look up if they created an account or not within kind of our Stripe. Are they a paid user? It's like, nope, don't exist. It's like, okay, you don't know my product. So you're just saying that versus like, I remember the investors like, oh, I've used this for 3 months. I didn't tell you, but I freaking love this thing. And are you guys raising? I want to have a conversation. That gives me more loyalty because you are loyal to me first, where you're taking the step and you're giving me value. You're giving me money in certain cases. I'm going to be more likely to be like, oh yeah, this is awesome. You know my product. You were an early believer. I would love you on the cap table. This would be awesome to have. So I think it's those two things. Be present, be on there, be really, it's called like for sales, it's called sequences, where you just set up a sequence where it's like every month you're saying, hey, how's it going? Here's the latest thing. Here's the latest thing. Do that. But then the second thing is keep using the product, show them value. And you have to really show the real value. You can't be like, oh, I can make intros. I can do this. Like a lot of people say that, but very few people follow through, or they do one and then it's done. It's the person that goes and says, hey, a month later, hey, I found another person. This person's really interested. I talked about your product. You interested in introduction? Like, yeah, this is great. So you got to be that salesperson a little bit. You've got to show that you want it.
Yeah. Wow. I love that. And I wonder at the beginning when they are introducing you to like the potential clients or like, potential value, how many times do you feel like people should be doing? You mentioned like not like a one time off kind of thing. So like as like a small angel investor, sometimes I felt like, some founders, they just never say anything. Like after you put in money, they're gone. But they're like great founders. Like they're the ones that raise like from like these bigger firms and stuff like that. But on the other hand, it's like there will be founders that are like always asking you for something. You're like, oh my God, am I like a part of the team right now? But how do you think about like from like an investor like adding value perspective on like, what's like the right balance? And like the other part, it's like from like the investor that you have worked with, like what if you're like, let's say if you and I are starting a fund, like what should be our differentiator? So for example, is that like helping you recruit like 2 engineer? Is that like helping you like closing the next round of funding? Or like what would be the actual things that like you feel like generally founder need help with? Or like some people are just saying like, oh, like you have to be there like psychiatrist, like just be there, talk to them through like random stuff. Like as a founder, like what's your advice for VCs to like quote unquote add value? And also like, since you started Read, I'm sure you guys have like jumped through many different like product cycles. So like at the beginning, the product may be like a different product than what it is today. What were something that like the investor would do to accelerate the process of helping you to find product market fit instead of like just telling you what to do, but on the other hand, like you're like, oh, you don't really know shit because like, I'm working on this every single day.
Yeah, I'd say there's real value and there's kind of peacocking fake value they provide. So fake value, I would go in and say is, hey, I can intro to these 50 people, and they don't actually pre-check about the intro, but they just say like, hey, here's an email. You should talk to Grace. She's great. This is it. And that's it. And they call it like, hey, I introduced 10 people. How'd they go? That's not high value. High value intros are going to be like, hey, I just talked with one of my friends. He's the head of procurement, and he would love to have you come in, or she's really looking at building out her sales organization. She could be a good use case for the product. I pinged her. She's actually interested. Are you open to that? Because now you're not going in to say, I made an intro and that's done. You've actually taken it a step further and qualified that lead. So it's very much like a sales process. You've qualified that lead. Because I will say, like, I've spoken with investors where they're trying to show me their value and they make like 6 intros. And I'm like, all right, now I have like an hour and a half to 3 hours of calls I have to do where there's no reason for this call. Like, other than like, this person's smart, I guess. They're nice, but what do you want? What value is the company getting out versus like.
And then sometimes they sell you back on something that they've done.
100%. And so I think it's important to actually show the value, to deliver the value. Or, hey, and this is probably a little controversial, but generally the value-added services from VCs are pretty like low value, to be honest. And by that, I don't mean like there's not a use case for them, but no VC generally is going to give you 10 engineers to join your team. They can introduce you to the VP of engineering that is looking for a role that's a really good fit that they vetted. That's great. So that's value. But the value add that most founders want is like, I need 10 engineers, or hey, I need a AE, a SDR, and maybe a director of sales. Can you give me that? They're not necessarily going to have those things. And so it's important to really keep in mind that there's only so much they can do with the value added services. So, but when you're a VC, I love it when VCs are like, this is a rock star engineer. She built X, Y, and Z, and she's looking right now, and I think it's a good fit. Do you want to make an intro? I'm like, yeah, all day long. So it's really the quality of the intros that you make. It's not just pre-qualifying, but it's the quality of what they need, because they don't need a bunch of mentors. Honestly, like, I think people overestimate the value of mentors in a startup because you're busy building a business. If someone has context that I could use, absolutely. But if you have 12 mentors that you're talking with once a month for an hour or two, that's not a good use of time. That's a quarter of a week that you're spending talking to mentors. Like, I would argue that's not the best use of your time. So talk with customers, talk with new employees to bring on board, talk with product, talk with users. All those things are better uses. So again, this is really about delivering value that is immediately quantifiable for the startup that you're trying to work with. And then if they don't give you a lot of updates, I think it goes 2 ways. I've been on the other side of this where I don't send a lot of updates. It means that things are really good, that I have no time. So you should be super happy that I'm just picking up all the money that's on the ground, or it's really bad. And you can get a sense of like, hey, when you look outside in, are they doing really well? Are they doing really poorly? If they're doing really poorly, it's not a bad idea to go in and say like, hey, just wanted to check in, noticed X, anything that I can help out on. Because you're an investor. You don't have to be mean, but you could be also direct to say like, hey, it doesn't look like this is working. You want to jump on a call and talk about it? Because a lot of times people don't come out and reach out when things are really bad. They reach out, oh, it's just great, man. I'd love to like introduce you for the next round. I think the value is when things aren't great, that's where the angels really step up.
I love that. I wonder, when it comes to like fundraising, what's your kind of like cadence for yourself? So for example, like, would you be like, oh, okay, so we're on like a 6-month fundraising cycle, and then there is like, 55 investor, we should chat next week? Or like, what's a kind of like, how fast do you schedule these meetings? And what would be like, I guess, like your advice for like the founders who are listening, who are like trying to raise something in the AI space, like especially in the application side.
Yeah.
So like they have so many competitors all the time. What would be like your maybe like top 3 steps to, number 1, find the right investor for you? Number 2, it's like, do you ask for do you ask for like advice to get money, or like do you ask for money to get money? Like and then number 3 is like actually close them. It's not like, oh, I'm interested, and then after like 6 meeting, obviously use Read.ai, but after 6 meeting later, then they're still like never closed or like ghosted or like something. Like, what's the vibe there?
If a VC doesn't reply back to you, don't ever follow up in general, because they're not interested. They're trying not to be mean. I actually like when they say, I'm not interested, you can move on. But generally, if they're not replying back, you thought it was a great call, they're like, what's next steps? If they really liked you, they would call you. They would write you. Like, there's not like, oh, I lost the traction. It's like, that's not it. So I think don't take it personally, but also don't try to resurrect something that is not going to be valuable, that is not going to happen. Like, you can ping, and then if the VC is nice, they're like, oh, that's great, keep me up to date, and you send updates, and it's like, hey, what do you think about that update? They're like, yeah, it's good, but they're not going to change their mind. Generally, I will say VCs are very quick to make decisions in their head. So if they really like something, they're going to go and say, I'm going to preempt the round. I'm going to come in and I want to give you a term sheet, even though you're not raising right now. They will make that decision on their own. You will not convince them to do that and give you a term sheet. The second I would say is every conversation is a pitch to raise money. Like, it is not like, hey, I'm just going to give you some information. I might do it a year from now. No, every single meeting is a pitch, because you're going in and you're trying to put yourself the best face. They also know, hey, you haven't raised in 18 months. You've got 40 employees. You only have $4 million. You're probably going to start raising. They know what's going on. They're not dumb. So I think treat every single meeting as a raise conversation versus going in and saying, oh, this is informal, but I'm kind of trying to get in there where it's like, maybe they'll be interested. It's always a raise. And I think the last thing from a fundraising standpoint, when you interact with VCs, is if you are doing anything with some traction, you will get a ridiculous amount of inbound pings. Your job as a founder is to go in and say, I'm not going to take every single one of those calls. You can go and say, hey, you're late stage. I'm a seed. I haven't raised my seed round yet. I am not going to talk with a late stage fund, because yeah, it'd be great to build a relationship. And I can reply back, hey, we're not at the scale. Let's push this back maybe 3 to 6 months and just push that back. But focusing on the ones that are the right fit for you, that you have the conversation. Don't just talk with the big fancy brand because like, oh, it's the big fancy brand, because you're not in the stage. So they're not going to invest. Like, I've had a lot of investment bankers ping me and say like, oh, we want to talk, we need to go IPO or really late stage. I'm like, yeah, I'm not there yet. Like, this is not going to be a good use of time for me. But for them, they want to build those relationships. But I want to get to that point that I want that relationship. And so that's what a founder should be focused on.
Totally. I want to be mindful of the time. So I'll wrap up with like a quick 1 minute fire round for you.
Yeah.
So what's your favorite book?
What's my what?
Favorite book?
Oh, favorite book. Made to Stick. So Made to Stick is kind of like, it's an old book, but it is just awesome about like storytelling, figuring out what resonates with people.
Wow, I'm totally gonna write that down, because originally I prepared another question about like, how do you become like a better storyteller? Because I think you're great at storytelling. I'm totally gonna check out that book. Who made the biggest impact in your career?
That'd be my parents. They really taught me you can solve any problem. You can't speak the language, you can learn the language. You can't make money, you can make money. If you can't sell cars, you can sell cars. You can't open a business, you can open a business.
Who would you invite to your dinner party?
Ooh, that is a good one. That is a good one. I would say any one of the last 4 presidents would make a very interesting conversation.
I like that you're just like the last 4 presidents.
Any one of them. No preference. Any 4 of them, I will take an invite.
Where can we find you outside of work?
Outside of work, you can find me on Twitter, X, David Shim, LinkedIn. If you look for David Shim, feel free to add me, follow me. But for fun, generally, it's spending outside of work. It's really spending time with family. It's really, you only get a certain amount of time, and I think it's really important to prioritize that.
Amazing. Well, David, thank you so much for coming to the show. It's been such a fun conversation.
Excellent. Thanks, Grace. This is awesome. I can see you've done many, many of these because you're a great host. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with your audience.
Thank you so much. Okay, let me just quickly end stream.